Something I've spent quite a lot of time recently is looking at people's positions with regard to science. All kinds of people's positions with regard to science, but especially Christians' positions with regard to science. You know, there are several different positions that anybody can hold with regard to science. I'd like to go through some of them and then deal with one specifically. This one position that specifically irks me. These are some of the other positions you can hold. The first is the overtly scientific position. That's the position that I hold. It's the position that actually most people hold. Even people that are neck deep in their theism, for 90% of issues in their lives, they hold an overtly scientific position. Now, I know what you're thinking. Most questions on a day-to-day level aren't overtly scientific. But let's not confuse kind of reductionism with science itself, because most questions have a scientific angle. If you lose your socks, where are my socks? Yeah, is that a scientific question? Well, in actual fact, it is very much a scientific question. And you can look at how people would answer that question. How many people would go down on bended knee and pray for the location of their socks? How many people would strip naked and dance round the garden in the hope that the socks would reveal themselves to them? Not many people. Most people would actually methodically start going round, looking first at the locations that are closest to where they are and are most likely to house the socks, and then ending up with the most distant locations and the locations that are least likely to have the socks. And hopefully somewhere on that journey the socks will turn up. That's the scientific approach, and it's the approach that 99% of people would take. It's only when it comes to certain issues to do with the universe and why are we here and who are we and why are we moral that people go outside of that scientific sphere at all. But what are the other positions? The first of these positions is the very scientific theistic position. This is the moderate or the accommodationist position that tries to shoehorn anything that science comes out with. They will accept, they'll take on board that it must be true, because basically these are people who understand that science works and that they have to allow for whatever science says. But they don't want to give up on their religious position. So somehow they will shoehorn yet another little chunk of science in until it's like a gigantic silicon tit, and their religion is just a thin veneer of flesh that's coating this gigantic silicon bag of science that lies within, that's like almost looks hard and shiny, like it's on the point of bursting out at any moment. That's how untenable to me their position can tend to become, but that is their position and that's their methodology. They maintain their theistic position with all the baggage. It's like the chains that Jacob Marley has on Scrooge. They're dragging these religious chains around with them, but they won't let go. They won't undo the manacle. They're going to keep carting them around. That's that position. Then we have the non-scientific literalists. These are people that couldn't give a shit about science. They're concerned just with what it says in the Bible, and that's it. Science just doesn't matter. Then finally we have the group that's really irked me. These are the ones on YouTube that I've been watching recently. These people are literalists. These people are biblical literalists as well. But these people are so keen to tell us about their scientific bent, their scientific credentials. These are people who say, no, I accept science. I love science. Look, let me list all these different bits of science that I like. In fact, I always accept science. I can see, good evidence. I can see the evidence for different bits of science, and I always accept that evidence totally unless it contradicts the Bible. If it contradicts the Bible, I go with the Bible. They'll tell you that absolutely unblinkingly. Now, if you want to go along with the Bible, go along with the Bible. But some of the things that these people say science contradicts the Bible, so they go along with the Bible, are things like evolutionary theory, things like the age of the earth. Things like there being an old earth, things like evolution having happened, are two of the most evidenced pieces of science, branches of science that we have. If science can get these things wrong, then on what grounds, what possible grounds have you for having any faith in any other parts of science? Why bother believing any branch of science? If you can have such a huge mountain of scientific evidence and still have fucked the whole thing up, why bother accepting science at all? That's what I can't get my head round with this position. That's what makes this position entirely untenable. In fact, it smacks to me of people saying, yeah, I accept science as long as it doesn't tell me what I don't want to hear, as long as it doesn't tread on something that's really valuable to me, because if it does, I'm just going to cover my eyes and cover my ears and pretend it doesn't exist. That's what it smacks of. If you think so little of science, that even when the evidence is stacked up to the ceiling, you can just topple it over and say, yep, but that's all wrong. If that's what you think, then fine, but don't accept any of science, because that's as big as the mountain of evidence gets. When the mountain of evidence is only that big, why accept it then? There's just no consistency. There's no value to science if you're just going to disregard it based on some book that was written by a load of goat-herding Bronze Age tribesmen 2,000 fucking years ago. Anyway, it's good to be back on YouTube. Mind how you go.